what we're going to talk about this morning is Genesis 39, verse 20 through 41. And I think it says 49 up here. I wanted to go through verse 52 because that's where you get to meet Joseph's two sons. And the names of his sons actually have something to say about what Joseph is going through. But, you know, I chose the title of this week's message as Bloom. And so there you see this adorable little purple flower. I'm not a botanist, so I don't really know what that is. Can anybody tell me what that is? I don't know either. Okay, but it's cute. And so here it is popping up between the bricks and the sidewalk there. And you kind of look at things that bloom in unlikely places, in hard conditions. And you look at that and you think to yourself, what are you doing there? This place where it's supposed to be barren, flat, wasteland, but there's life popping up in the midst of it. There's beauty popping up in the midst of it. It's kind of like a little slice of heaven. It's a little glimpse of what God is doing in this world. So before we get into that, I want to ask you some questions. So as we look at the next slide here, I want to ask you, I'm a teacher, so I do the kind of interactive thing, so I want some responses this morning. What do these two things have in common? I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up and came of age in the 80s, so we had the movie Gremlins. And so, you got the movie Gremlins, and on the right, y'all know what that is? That's kudzu. My friend Eric Hamilton's not here this morning, but I guess he's an environmental science guy. He could tell us all about how it seemed like a good idea at the time to bring over kudzu as a way to prevent soil erosion, and next thing you know, no more kudzu. This is actually a picture from somewhere in Atlanta, Georgia. We've got it all around the South. Kudzu just taking over everything. What do these two have in common? It's okay. It's okay to talk. Huh?
They grow fast.
They grow fast. What do we know about gremlins? There's two things you're not supposed to do. Don't get them wet.
Don't feed them.
Don't feed them after midnight. Okay? That will result in more gremlins, and they're not always good gremlins. Okay? They get out of hand. With kudzu, maybe it seemed like a good idea to bring that stuff over, but next thing you know, it is eating and swallowing sections of the interstate. Okay? It's like, Godzilla! Kudzu is just taking over, and you look up and there's these big kudzu monsters on the side of the road. So these things spread, and they spread quickly and surprisingly. Well, let's look at our next slide. What do these two things have in common? Okay. All right. We've already got some good answers here. On the left, you see a cockroach. Okay. And on the right, you see Keith Richards, guitarist for the Rolling Stones. Okay. You say, hold on, you're a Bible studies guy and you're doing this in church? It's okay. Trust me. I can do this. So, what do these two have in common? We've got an early submission up here.
What was it?
Okay, they've been around forever because they do what?
Evolve.
I don't know if they evolve. They survive, don't they? If a nuclear war hits and takes out all life on the planet, there's going to be two forms of life that survive: cockroaches and Keith Richards. Okay? It's probably why he can't be killed by conventional weapons. All right. So, when we look at that which spreads and that which survives, even in harsh conditions, and we look at the message through the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, to the people of God, God's covenant people, we come to the story of Joseph. So the story so far is this. The patriarchs, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all had rival sons. Some of them had sons by different wives. They played favorites. And usually at some point, a son was sent away. Okay, we see that with Abraham sending Ishmael away. Isaac and Rebekah send Jacob away to flee from the wrath of Esau. And among Jacob's sons, we see that there's this thing waiting to happen, that one of the sons is going to be sent away if the pattern holds and continues. Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, because Jacob screwed up and married two sisters. It wasn't his fault. They didn't mean to do it. He just woke up in the morning and it wasn't the one that he expected. It was her older sister, Leah. And he was a trickster, but that kind of got turned around on him. His uncle Laban, he kind of met his match as far as the trickster and his uncle Laban there. He wound up married to two sisters. Both of them were barren when they got married, couldn't have kids, and so they did an ancient Mesopotamian custom of bringing in their handmaids, their servants, and using them as surrogate wives to bear children, concubines, secondary wives. So you have Team Leah and you have Team Rachel, okay? And they get into this baby breeding battle because your significance as a woman in that society at that time was whether or not you could provide a male heir. And so the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and so she gets the first. And so you see, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, and then Rachel says, and she brings in her maidservant, and there's a couple there, and Leah's like, oh, no, you didn't, and she brings in her maidservant, and there's a couple of sons there, and then Leah's all of a sudden like, I'm back in the game. After a number of years, she's bearing children again, and then finally, the 11th son, first one for Rachel herself. This is the girl that Jacob wanted to marry originally, was Joseph, Yosef. In Hebrew it means add, may he add. So she's having this son, and she's just like, she's got her hands in the air like she's crossing the finish line saying, yes, yes, let's do it again, let's add, come on, more sons, more sons. And if she knew what was ahead, she wouldn't have said that, because her second son, she died in childbirth, giving birth to him. And as he passes out of her, she's dying. She names him Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. And then she dies, which is super sad. I mean, if you were Ben-Oni walking around all your life, it's like, hey, you know what you did. Son of my sorrow. Poor guy's probably kind of goth, wears a lot of the eyeliner, dresses in black trench coats and stuff like that. There he is swinging on the swimming playground. You call him to come in for dinner. Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, come in for lunch. Okay. All depressed, doesn't spill a lot of the cure. So the deal is Jacob says, I'm not having that. He says, we're going to name him something different. Thank God he named him Ben-Yamin, son of my right hand. My little right hand man, my little buddy. I'm going to keep him close. But here's the deal. Joseph, especially before, with the exception of Benjamin, his little brother, by Rachel, he's the youngest. They're at the tail end. But there's this thing going on in the patriarch's families. The younger always kind of overthrows the paradigm and subverts the older. And so it's very interesting. That's the way it was for Jacob. And so he likes to root for the underdog. So Joseph becomes the favorite. So as we look at this next slide, we see that Joseph receives preferential treatment. He gets a fancy coat. It's often called multicolored, but the Hebrew is weird. It means it's kind of like a long robe with special sleeves on it. But whatever it is, it's special. And he's kind of like the prince of the family. And the brothers are not liking that. He sends all the older brothers to go shepherd and pull shepherd duty, and he doesn't have to. He gets to stay home, and then his dad sends him out to kind of report on. So he's being set up. I mean, he's really kind of a snot-nosed punk brat when we first meet him. He's 17 years old. And he tells everybody about this pair of dreams that he has where he was ruling over everybody. He's like, hey guys, I had this dream, and I rule, okay? And his brothers hate that. Not only do they hate him, they take the opportunity to sell him into slavery. And they deceive his father Jacob into thinking that he's dead. Once in Egypt, he rises to prominence as a steward in Potiphar's house. Potiphar is one of the royal officials, the captain of the guard in the palace. But he was thrown into prison due to resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife. Now, before we move on here, I want you to see something. There's always, in most Old Testament texts, a polarity that goes back and forth. Like if you got a car battery, you got a positive and a negative node. Okay, you got a positive and a negative terminal. There's a blessing thing and there's a curse thing. There's a life thing and there's a death thing. Because embedded in most Old Testament texts, there is a reading for the generation that came out of Egypt. There's a reminder that God loves us. He's blessed us unconditionally through His grace. He has rescued us. He has saved us. That is the Old Testament message of redemption. It was coming out of slavery and oppression in Egypt. But then there's this other message, not just the Exodus message, but the exile message. Because after they come into the land later on, after they settle back in the promised land, after they develop a kingdom, they quit following the Torah. They quit following the covenant. And the curse of exile kicks in. And so God says, I brought you into this land. And just like your mama said, I brought you into this world. And I can take you out. And so there's this exile thing going on too. You can be judged. And the curse of death, the death principle in the Old Testament, is that you would die separated, apart from the land in exile. There's an Exodus reading. Blessing, positive, grace. There's an exile reading. How are we going to cope in judgment? Okay? And there's the struggle that people have with God, that the people of God had. So when you read this back into the story of Joseph, this is what we see. We see this up-down thing going. Joseph starts off with this dream, and this dream, who gave him those dreams in the beginning? I don't want to sound like, TBN and prosperity gospel and all that kind of stuff. It's like, God just wants to bless you, okay, all the time. Well, here's the deal. Who gave Joseph those dreams? God gave him those dreams. Those were divinely given dreams for Joseph. And so because of that dream, he thinks he's all that in a stack of chips until he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. And he ends up on the bottom. And then he rises to prominence in Potiphar's household, rises to the top. And then he gets unjustly accused and gets thrown into prison. So he's back at the bottom. And then when we look in verse 20, okay, what do we see? I'll take a look here. I actually didn't put verse 20 up there. Let's look and see what it says in Genesis chapter 39. Verse 20. It says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison and placed him where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, so this is the prison for royal prisoners. Okay? This is what happens. It says the Lord was, and we have underlined, italicized, and emboldened a very crucial preposition. What does that say? The Lord was what? With Joseph. Here Joseph is on the bottom because there's this up-down thing. He keeps climbing to the top of the ladder, getting knocked back down. Climbing to the top of the ladder, knocked back down. And it's like, sheesh, what is the deal? It's like this roller coaster of Joseph's life. I don't know if your life has ever been like that. You're just thinking, what next? Okay? Here he is. He's all the way at the bottom. But who is there? Who is there with him? The Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is with him in the prison. The Lord was with Joseph and extending kindness to him. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was, say it again, with him. And the Lord made everything that he did successful. What was Joseph's dream in the beginning? That he would keep rising to rule. And every time he ends up at the bottom, he just naturally rises to rule. Maybe even supernaturally. The Lord has given him wisdom The Lord has given him favor. God did not forsake Joseph, but gave him favor. That's the first thing that we see. And so then, here he is in the prison. So the next scene that we see is this. In the prison, in chapter 40, he meets two guys that had been thrown into prison. The king of Egypt is Pharaoh. Pharaoh has this big retinue, this big court of officials. And among them is this guy called a cupbearer, and another guy is a baker. Now, it's not really hard to guess what their jobs are. Okay? The cupbearer, it's kind of in his name. What does he do? He bears the cup. But it's easy to get the wrong idea. I mean, you just think of a guy with a little white towel over his arm. Think, hey, I guess he'll, whatever he drink, wine or whatever. And so, here he is. It's not like that. Cupbearers are really high officials. They're kind of in charge of a lot of stuff. They're in charge of seeing that the food and the drink that's served in the royal court is not poisoned. If anybody's going to poison the king, it has to go through the cupbearer. He's like a canary in the mine, okay? He's kind of like a guinea pig, all right? Cupbearers become very high trusted officials in ancient Near Eastern courts. You see this with Nehemiah later on in the Old Testament. He's a cupbearer that King Artaxerxes of Persia sent back as a governor of Judea. And so this cupbearer, he's not just some guy, all right? He's not just a waiter. He's a high royal official. There's another guy, the baker. He's in charge of the food. So you got somebody in charge of this stuff and somebody in charge of the kitchen over here. And you're thinking, wow, these are royal prisoners. And Joseph is making sure everything gets done. He's making the rounds because he's kind of risen to that position there. And he meets these guys and he sees that their faces are downcast. And in chapter 40, I'll sum it up for you. In chapter 40, he says, guys, why the long faces? And they said, well, we've had a dream. Now, the idea of a dream in the ancient Near East, if it was just, regular dream, I mean, we dream all the time. But this idea that this is recorded, that these are nobles, that these are officials, this means something. But because they're not part of the court, guess what? They can't get this dream interpreted. So they know this means something. They both had similar dreams. They've been comparing notes. There's some very interesting similarities to their dreams. But they don't know what it means, and they can't get it interpreted. And so Joseph sets the stuff aside and sits down and folds his arms and says, well, guys, we're talking about dreams. I know a little something about dreams. I had a couple of dreams once. Why don't you shoot and tell me what your dream is, and I'll see if I can interpret that for you. And so the cupbearer goes first. And he says, okay, I remember I was back at my old job, and there was the Pharaoh, and there was these 3 vines, these 3 clusters of grapes, and I reached up to squeeze the wine into the cup, and I gave it to him, and he lifted up my head, and I was like this. And Joseph says, that's a positive dream. This is good. This is the life principle. He says the 3 vines are 3 days. He says in 3 days, on the king's birthday, you are going to get your job back. He's going to lift up your countenance to where you're going to be looking up like, okay, and things are going to be all peachy keen again for you. And so the cupbearer said, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. He said, now listen, when I get out of here, when you get out of here, I want you to remember that I did this for you. He's like, oh, sure thing, man. You're a lifesaver. Now, the baker, you got to feel bad for this guy. Because whatever was going on, wherever he was in there, he looks at the cupbearer's dream that is a positive interpretation, and he just rushes in like, ooh, do my next. Okay? So this isn't some kind of a divining tarot thing like you're always going to get a good message and what you're going to hear. He just thinks that, oh, it's all good. It's like, whoa, come on. He says, no, I had a similar dream. It was similar. He says, I had the 3 baskets of bread. I was back at my old job, and it was on my head, and I was kind of balancing this tray, and these big black birds, these raven crows, swooped down, and they were like, And then they're like, and eating. And then the bread was going everywhere, and there was no bread left. That's good, right? No, it's not. Really wish you hadn't told me that, because I got to give you bad news. 3 baskets, 3 days, big black crows of death eating your bread. Not good, bro. Okay, here's what's going on. In 3 days, you're going to be before the king, and he's going to lift up your head like off your body. Like, okay? You're going to be beheaded and impaled on a stake. The baker's like, oh, thanks, I guess, for interpreting my dream. Well, what happens? You know what happens. 3 days later is the king's birthday, Pharaoh's birthday. And cupbearer gets set free, goes back to his old job. Baker's executed. All right? And you can just imagine him as he's leaving the prison. He's like, I won't forget you. And Joseph's like, don't forget me. And it's like, okay, we're bros, right? He's, yeah, man. He's like, hook your brother up. All right. Doesn't hear from him for 2 years. You know, so there it was. It rose to prominence and then back down again. Just kind of, it's let down. But what we see here is something very interesting. There is a guy in a king's prison, and he's the son of a nomadic shepherd. He is not royalty. He is not nobility. He came into Egypt as a slave, and he knows the future. He can interpret dreams that God gives, and the Egyptian empire, can't. God's power is breaking in to this place of Egypt. God gave Joseph facts about the future that they didn't have. Well, as we move to the last scenario, the last vignette of our story, Pharaoh has a pair of dreams. Just like Joseph had a pair of dreams. Just like we saw a pair of dreams with the cupbearer, life, and the baker, death. Now we see 2 dreams. The first dream that Pharaoh has, he sees these cows, all right, coming up out of the Nile. And if you know anything about Egypt, Egypt pretty much is the Nile. I mean, look at some satellite photography. It's all like yellow and brown dirt, desert, and then there's there's a ribbon of reflective blue, and there's a little bit of green on both sides. The Nile is Egypt. Okay? One of the reasons Egypt became this great empire is because all the ancient empires would arise next to a water source that would give them predictable waters for agriculture. If you've got agriculture, you can have a standing army, and you can build a civilization. You can have an empire. Egypt was a world superpower because of the Nile. Egypt is the Nile. And every year when it overflows its banks, they channel that water into the farms, into the crops right next to it. And so Pharaoh's having this dream, and there he is by the Nile, because Egypt is the Nile. And these cows come up out of the river, 7 of them. In the ancient Near East, 7 was like this magic number. It was the number of perfection, the number of completion, the number of fullness. 7 big, fat, sleek cows. If you got cows, that's the kind you want. So he saw 7 of them. He's like, this is good. This is the way things ought to be in Egypt. And then something happened. I heard some guys talking beforehand, I think, about the upcoming season of a certain show that shoots around here. It has to do with zombies. These 7 zombie-looking cows come out of the Nile next. They're all emaciated, bad B horror movie looking skinny cows. And they come up to the other 7 cows and they eat them. Cows eating cows. That's cow cannibalism. That's crazy. Alright? Anyway, cows don't eat cows. They eat grass, right?
Zombies.
Zombie cows eat cows. So these cows eat, they devour the other cows, and Pharaoh's freaking out. He's like, oh my goodness, I've never seen cows eat cows. And they're skinny cows, and they're eating the big fat cows, but they're still skinny. They devour them, but there's no evidence left that there were ever any big 7 fat cows. And then he's freaking out about that, but there's a second dream. There he is, and there's these 7 big fat plumps, ears of wheat that come up there. The bread basket of the ancient Near East was Egypt, there in the Nile Delta, and there he is. Oh, nice, beautiful stalks. They're going to make a lot of bread out of that wheat right there. And then these sickly, scorched, thin stalks of wheat grew up. And those 7 stalks ate the other 7 big, plump ears of wheat. What is going on? Plants don't eat plants. Okay, well, okay, maybe. No, I don't know. I don't know of any plants that eat plants. It's weird. Zombie plants. And there's nothing left. And he is freaking out. In chapter 40, he is out of his mind. He gets up in the morning. He calls all the people of the court together. He gets all the wise men and the diviners and the magicians. And he's freaking out. He's begging people, please, I don't know what this means. They're all standing around like, oh, you know. And they're trying to figure it out. And for some reason, the world superpower just went dumb. Nobody knows. And the cupbearer comes in to do his job. There's all this buzz going on. It's like, what's going on, fellas? And they're like, Pharaoh's had 2 dreams. Nobody knows what they are. And all of a sudden, he's just like, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, head of the world's superpower, sir. I hate to bring this up. You know, a couple of years ago when you were mad and you threw me in jail, I really hate bringing it in the baker. And you like, you know, I really hate bringing this up. It's just like, just get to the point. He says, there's a dude in there that told us what was going to happen with our dreams. It's just some guy. But he nailed it. And he's like, well, why are we all standing around waiting on him? Chop, chop. There Joseph is in the prison. Biding his time down here. And he gets called up to the big wigs. He gets that call. They say, shave off your beard. Because, I mean, he's Semitic. He's all shepherdy, you know, scraggly. He says, put on the gown liner that those Egyptians did, put on the stuff, and you're going to go before Pharaoh in the royal court. He shows up. Pharaoh says, I heard that you can tell me what my dreams mean, and I hope you're good at this because I don't know, and I'm freaking out, and none of my people know here, and we're on the top end, and here you are, so I really hope you got something for me. And Joseph says something that probably made everybody's heart stop. He says, I can't. Everyone's like, you know, the cupbearer's like, oh great, I'm going to die. I can't. It's not in me. He said, but there's a God who can. There's a God who reveals the meaning of dreams. And so, I'll tell you what they mean, but you need to know that it's this God doing it. Now, whose God is he talking about? He's talking about who? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not talking about the powerful gods of Egypt. Pharaoh's begging. Pharaoh, you don't know all of his nobility. You don't know the empire, Egyptian empire. You don't know. You don't have the power to figure this out. But here, the God who condescends and comes down to be with his people, even in their suffering, shows up and gives all this knowledge and all this wisdom and all this authority to this guy from the shepherd people, Joseph. And so Joseph says, 2 dreams are one. They've been repeated for emphasis to make sure that you know this. He says it's fairly straightforward. It's a life and death principle. You know, you got your cattle and you got your crops. Duh. I mean, look at this stuff. The 7, that's 7 years. Okay, there's going to be 7 years of plenty. But after that, it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine that are so bad that it's going to eat up everything that was gained during the first 7 years of plenty. And so then you're going to be in dire straits. And he says, if I can go ahead and make a suggestion, you ought to put somebody really wise in charge of this stuff so that during those 7 years, you can store up stuff and have enough to get you through the 7 years of famine that are coming afterward. So now there's this contest. You know, who's going to be the wise guy? to put in charge of all this. The contest starts and then it finishes right there on the spot, because Pharaoh looks at him and says, you're the one with the bat phone to God. Okay. You're the one that can interpret these dreams. It has the red phone that rings, and it's like, oh, well, that's what the dream is? Okay. God, that's what it means? Okay. Here's what it means. He says, you're the one that just did this in front of all of us. He says, so here's the deal. You are second in command. And when you actually look in the text and you see what it says in chapter 41, I want you to hear, this is very interesting how this goes down. He says, you're the second in command dude. And this is what he says in verse 41. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Imagine being a part of the Exodus generation that just came out of the oppression from Egypt and hearing this. They're saying, hold on, you're telling me one of us was in charge? The only reason these guys got so great so that they could oppress us is through the intelligence of one of our own ancestors. It's like ironic, isn't it? Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He gave him his power. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in chariot as his second command. Men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. Okay. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest of Heliopolis, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. And so basically, the following verses, Joseph stores up all the grain. And when people, when the famine hits, he sells grain. And when they run out of money, they give their land. And so now Pharaoh becomes powerful. Egypt, the nobility becomes even more powerful. This is going to kind of turn around and bite them later on. But then in verse 50, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest of Heliopolis. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And that's where we're going to stop as far as the story of Joseph is concerned. We see before the famine, 2 sons. Manasseh, in Hebrew it means to cause to forget. He says, I'm putting my past behind me. He says, all this up-down stuff where I kept getting knocked down to the bottom. He says, I'm where God wants me to be now. That dream has come true. And so I'm going to forget that stuff. And then he names the second son Ephraim. Ephraim means fruitful. He says, God has blessed me. Okay? So these names are significant. Okay? Your name in Scripture is your character. It's kind of your destiny. It's what's going to happen with you. So we've come through the story. We saw that God did not forsake Joseph, but gave him Pharaoh. That God gave him facts about the future. And just now we saw that God did not forget Joseph, but gave him a focus. He gave Joseph the task of saving the entire ancient Near East. Egypt is the breadbasket. If there's a famine, where do you go to buy grain? You go to Egypt. Joseph saved Egypt. Later on, next week, or whenever Scott is going to preach about this, you're going to see how he saved his family too, through forgiveness, reconciliation. But in the meantime, let's bring this through the Bible here. Let's keep moving on. The message is to bloom where you're planted, even in hard situations. Joseph had a big dream where he had an important task, but that dream was not just for him. It was about something bigger. God gave him authority. God gave him position. God gave him influence. Not just like the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat that it's all about him and he's the center of the universe and all this kind of stuff. It's not just about you when you have that. You exist for God and you also exist for other people. There's this love God and love your neighbor as yourself thing, and here's you in the pipeline. And so here you are right here in the elbow of that thing. And if that's the reason you exist, then any gift that you are given is to add to loving God and loving your neighbor as self. It's not just so that you can keep getting to the top of your pyramid and being, hey, it's all about me. It's all about self. It's all about power. Okay? That's not why Joseph was to rule. So God kind of broke him of that. Joseph's story was an answer, if you go back one slide there. Joseph's story was an answer to the question of how Israelites wound up in Egypt, but it was also a strategy for how to cope with being subject to other powers. Be a blessing. When he found himself as a slave in Egypt, at the bottom rung, in Potiphar's house, he said, okay, I got two ways I can go. I can get bitter, or I can get better. I can be a blessing, or I can be a curse. If you're a slave, what incentive, what motivation do you have to get better and to be a blessing to those around you? You're a slave. What possible motivation could you have? What was Joseph focusing on? He's focusing on the fact that in the beginning, God gave him a dream. It was a divine dream. It was given by God, and it had not come to pass yet. And that's what he's holding on to. He said, so I better get used to making everything around me better. I better get used to being a blessing, not just for myself, but for others. And that's what he did. And even when he got knocked down, back in prison, when he got thrown into prison, same deal. He could get better, or he could get bitter. He could bless others, or he could curse. What was his motivation? And not only that, God's people needed this message whenever they found themselves later on in exile under Babylon. There's an Exodus reading, there's an exile reading. Have you noticed how similar Daniel is to Joseph? Let me repeat that, because sometimes this doesn't hit us when we study the Bible. Daniel is the Joseph of Babylon and Persia. He's the one who is taken into captivity in a foreign land, like Joseph. He's the one who rises to prominence in the king's court. He's the one who gives wisdom and interprets the king's dreams that are given to him by Israel's God. He's the one that becomes a blessing. Whether it's a time of blessing, Exodus, whether it's a time of exile, hard times, be a blessing. We have a task. That was the strategy to cope. It was a strategy to early Christians, and that's what we see in the next slide. The early Christians used the same strategy with the household codes of Greco-Roman society. When the Jesus movement took over in the 1st century AD, when it started taking off, it was so radically different and subversive to the entire code of life in the Greco-Roman world, because they were all about getting to the top. They were all about honor for self. And there were tons of slaves, and there were tons of hierarchies. And Jesus comes along. Jesus comes along. God coming all the way down in Jesus Christ. Not to the power people on top, not to the Romans, but to an occupied, oppressed people, the Jews. And among them, he doesn't come to the leaders. He doesn't come to the nobility. He doesn't come to the leadership. He comes down to the poor people. When Jesus was born, and as the firstborn, his offering was given at the temple, they gave the poorest offering you could give. And he lives his life as a handyman for 30 years. He's a tekton. Tekton means handyman. You could have pulled up beside a Home Depot and said, I need 2 for building a shed. And Jesus would have jumped on the back of your truck. That's who Jesus was. He was God coming all the way down. And he didn't stop there. He did everything he was supposed to do. And his society and the Roman Empire did the only thing they knew that they could do with righteous people. They ground them up in the machine and they threw them up on a cross as a sign saying, don't be this guy. But in Jesus on the cross, the powers of this world were judged, because the great had become humble. The high had become low. And the only reason to become a servant is love. Jesus was proof that God is good and that he loves us. And that he loves all of us, from the tip top all the way down. So that now we have no excuse, because Jesus is our example. You know who dies on a cross in the Roman Empire? That death is reserved for rebels and for slaves. Jesus knew what it was like to be an oppressed, occupied slave, just like Joseph. And so we see that same DNA, that same attitude, that same stance, that I am going to love even my enemies. I'm going to love and be a blessing no matter what. That is not in us. That's not me. I don't wake up that way. Here's my wife. She can tell you. I wake up in the flesh. I wake up, I'm about me. I'm going to get my coffee and my cereal. All right? And then at some point, Jesus occurs to me throughout my morning, and I have to flatten my kingdom. It's not about me. It's about this. It's about humility. It's about going down. It's the upside down principle. We climb to our doom. We descend to our greatness. Jesus said, the first among you shall be last, the last among you shall be first. He said, if you want to be great, you must be servant of all. And then he proved it by getting on a Roman cross. So when this takes root in Christian communities, they're dealing with Greco-Roman society and their household codes. And then they say, we see Paul telling the people at Colossae, he says, and whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And then he continues, next slide, verse 18 through 22. And he goes through the household codes. He talks to wives, and he talks to husbands. He talks to children. He talks to fathers. And he ends up and spends a long time talking to who? Slaves. Now, a lot of people criticize the New Testament for not being harder on slavery. I don't know if you saw the old Spartacus movie with Kirk Douglas. Slave revolts didn't always end well for the slaves. It ended up with a lot of people on crosses dying. And he spends a long time saying this. In verse 22, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism. He is telling slaves, where do you get off telling slaves that their stance ought to be this, that you serve everybody, that you love everybody, that you be excellent, that you always get better, not bitter, that you be a blessing and not a curse, that you bring life and not death? Who gets off telling us that if we're on the bottom, if we're going through hard times? Jesus can tell us that. His apostles can tell us that. Because they've been there and they've done that. And Joseph is an example. So as we come to the nasty now and now, in this next slide, bloom where you're planted, we need this same example for us to coat today. I don't know where you're at in your life. I know where we're at in my family. I know the other people that I talk to, and pastors that I meet with, and deacons that I meet with, and churches, and just people in the church, and I meet and I talk with people, and they're telling me about how the economy has affected them. They're telling me about how disease has overtaken and tragedy has struck their family, and they're living in this bombed out crater of their life. And they're wondering, where's God? Where's the blessing? Where's the favor? And it's easy for us to forget that God has come down in it with us. That He is here. He is present. That He is near in Jesus Christ. The Holy Spirit that was sent in the New Testament is called the Spirit of Christ. He is with us, living in us and through us. And He can enable us and empower us to cope and to deal and to live above all that if we yield to His Spirit. It's not in us normally.